Under normal circumstances, I would never have accepted a deployment like this, not without questions, not without context. But when the message came through the encrypted channel, marked with a clearance tier higher than anything I'd seen during my years working civil military observation posts, I didn't hesitate. There was a strange pressure in the phrasing, not an invitation, not even a request, just a directive, effective immediately. You are to report to Sal 6 Observatory. Coordinates attached. You are the replacement. That was all. No signature, no contact frequency, no logistical prep. The message vanished seconds after being read, replaced by static code. I checked the map 3 times before I realized where they were sending me. A dead zone in the Mojave's outer rim, deeper than I'd ever gone. A patch of desert even satellites seemed to ignore. Sal 6, I'd never heard of it. The drive out was long and deliberately uneventful. A black vehicle was waiting for me outside my apartment the next morning. No markings. The driver never spoke. I wasn't even asked to bring gear, just told to wear. He traded clothing and carry my personal ID. The windows were blacked out after the first few hours. By the time we stopped, my sense of direction was fractured by hours of silence, heat, and the vibration of tires over dust. When the door opened, I felt the desert's breath immediately, heavy, dry, and oddly metallic. The sky was wrong. Not cloudless, featureless, not a shade of blue I recognized. It was as if a flat ceiling of brightness had been hung overhead, forcing the land into submission. The structure known as Sol 6 was more bunker than observatory, squatting low on the sand like a concrete blister, painted with peeling white stripes and half buried under dunes. From a distance, it looked abandoned, almost consumed. Up close, I could see signs of movement-recent footprints around the narrow metal stairwell that led underground. Ventilation ports still spinning in slow, lethargic circles, but no people, no guards, no welcoming officer. Only a handwritten note taped to the door, scrawled in black grease pencil. He left during cycle 10. Don't touch the mirrors. That's how my assignment began. Inside, the temperature dropped sharply. The hallway lights were dim, flickering in a way I first attributed to poor wiring, until I noticed they were pulsing in rhythm with the ambient hum. Not electrical, not machine-generated. It was as though the building itself had a pulse. The walls were lined with lead panels, scraped in places where someone had run fingernails or metal tools along them, leaving long, shallow gouges. There was no signage, only arrows drawn in chalk or soot, pointing down corridors or marking doors with cryptic symbols. I followed them because there was no other choice. The central console room was roughly circular, with a sunken middle platform housing the main telemetry interface. Everything was analog: dials, gauges, worn buttons with flaking paint. No screens, no digital readouts. A strange choice for a solar observatory, especially in a facility that clearly had once possessed cutting-edge funding. Files were strewn across a metal desk, yellowed with time and heat, and almost every page was stamped with the initials THH in the bottom corner. No full name, just that. There were logs too, kept in thick notebooks bound in cracked leather. Many were empty, but one had the final entry highlighted with a string tied around the page. Sun has not moved. Day 3. No confirmation from command. Still no contact with previous technician. Mirrors humming again. I don't think it's vibration. I think it's breathing. That was the first moment I hesitated. I stood there in the silence of the control room, listening for something that wasn't mechanical, something that would validate the paranoia inked into those final sentences. But all I heard was the whine of wind through the exhaust shafts and the slow insectile tick of cooling metal. The building creaked from heat stress. Yes, but there was nothing alive in it. Nothing except me. Or so I told myself. I spent the first 2 days adjusting equipment, cataloging conditions, and trying to establish contact with any kind of central network. The dish array outside was still functional, though sand had overtaken much of its pivot track. When I realigned it to face Geosat Grid 3, hoping for a pingback from the northern relay, the response was a burst of static followed by something else. A tone, constant, low, vibrating right into my sternum like an engine idling inside my chest. It played for exactly 11 seconds, then silence. I ran diagnostics, thinking it was interference. But the system had recorded nothing. The log remained blank. The sound had no origin, no destination, just presence. That night I stood on the outer platform and waited for the sun to set. It didn't. I watched it hover near the edge of the horizon like a frozen spotlight, heat blurring the sand until it looked like liquid. I waited for the sky to shift, for color to bleed into the clouds. But there were no clouds, no birds, no distant jet contrails. The entire dome above me remained still, painted in that wrong high-tension hue. The clocks inside ticked forward. My watch did too, but the shadows around the compound never moved. On day 3, I returned to the upper walkway of the observatory's dome, hoping to find some optical error, some atmospheric lensing that could explain the impossibility. I found instead a large covered mirror bolted into place behind a set of observation shutters. A note hung from the latch, written in the same thick pencil: "Never uncover, unless you're ready to hear it again." I didn't touch it. Instead, I made the first of my official transmissions. No one responded. I said my name. I gave my credentials. I gave coordinates. I gave the number of days the sun had remained visible. I described the light, the sky, the pulse in the equipment, the hum in the steel floors, the sense of movement beneath the foundation. I asked for confirmation of Cycle 10. I asked if anyone knew who THH was. I asked why I was sent here. I ended the transmission with something I hadn't intended to say. If you hear this, please tell me what time it is where you are. Please tell me if night still happens. The silence afterward didn't feel empty. It felt like listening to someone breathe on the other side of a door. And still, the sun stayed exactly where it was. I began to understand the structure of SAL-6, not through schematics or briefing documents. None were ever provided, but through steps. Steps repeated daily across identical hallways, through humidity-stained corridors with rusted vent grills and walls that wept mineral streaks like dried blood. You learn a building not by map, but by habit. I counted panels. I memorized the turns by smell, by heat, by the way certain doors refused to close entirely, their warped frames permanently ajar. At the heart of the facility, just beneath the central dome, sat the primary solar telescope, a monolithic construct of scorched brass and jet-black casing, angled toward the dome's overhead slit, where the unmoving sun bore down relentlessly through the reinforced lens. Even though the telescope hadn't been properly powered in weeks, maybe months, heat still radiated from its casing, as if something continued to pass through it, regardless of instrumentation. There was no dust on the lens, no bugs, no fingerprints. The only surface in the entire compound that remained perfectly clean. Every time I entered the dome, I felt an urge to bow my head without understanding why. The observatory was far larger than I expected. Most of it was subterranean, extending like an anchor beneath the sand. Levels upon levels of hollow metal echo chambers, each with different functions I couldn't quite interpret. Some rooms were lined with lead tiling and microphone clusters suspended from the ceiling like spider sacks. Others contained nothing but reinforced chairs facing small windows into pitch-black compartments. One room was padded, not like a cell, but like a coffin, a rectangular cavity lined with velvet, just large enough for a human body. When I stepped inside and closed the door for 3 seconds, my ears popped and didn't recover for hours. There were no instructions, no explanations. Just decades of silence packed into chambers that smelled like static and metal fatigue. Outside, the wind changed. It had been nearly still when I arrived, but by the 4th day, it began to push against the compound with rhythmic insistence. Not violent, but deliberate as if tracing the seams of the building. I stood on the main deck and watched the dunes around the observatory shift slightly every hour, always away from the sun. The sand seemed to dry further each day, cracking like ash, breaking apart in sharp patterns that vaguely resembled symbols if seen from the right angle. There were no animals, no birds, not even insects, not even the occasional dry rattle of desert snakes. The only sound was the groan of metal expanding in the heat, and the whisper of wind carving new truths into the earth. And always, the light flat, dry, crushing, like someone had poured bleach over the sky and left it to bake. There was an old generator chamber near the lower levels, partly collapsed from a sand breach, but accessible through a back corridor lined with air filters long since blackened beyond use. I found spare power cells stacked neatly in a corner, untouched and clean. Someone had been down here recently, but there were no logs, no trace of activity in the system. The auxiliary power had been set to cycle manually, and every dial reset to 0 before I arrived. A ritual, perhaps, or someone trying to erase time. Among the wires, I discovered a thin audio cable leading nowhere, ending in a bare plug that had been wrapped in copper foil and pressed into the base of a support beam. It vibrated gently when held, like a heartbeat, and emitted no signal I could trace, yet the hum behind my teeth always grew louder when I touched it. On the 5th day, I began having headaches. Not the kind born from dehydration or heat stroke, but something else, something that seemed to move from one side of my skull to the other, depending on the time of day. I tried to record them, marking their arrival and departure on the analog wall clock I kept beside the cot in my quarters. But the hands of the clock had begun to stutter, sometimes skipping backward by a minute or two, then catching up suddenly. My wristwatch, synced to the internal system clock, began losing seconds with each cycle. The compound itself seemed to reject temporal consistency. I couldn't remember how long I'd been awake. Sleep came in fits, and the dreams that followed were soaked in solar flare imagery, white circles, elongated shadows, a voice that sounded like mine speaking in perfect reverse. There was a mural buried behind old equipment crates in one of the unused labs, hand-painted, almost delicate, a depiction of the sun knot, the burning sphere we all grew up seeing in textbooks, but something more abstract. A great golden eye with concentric rings of mouths radiating outward, each mouth open in perfect silence. Surrounding it were human figures bent in prostration, faceless, arms raised as if pleading or worshipping, their feet buried in sand. Someone had written in fine script below it, now faded and fragmented, "We do not observe it. It observes us through the lens we built." I started to understand, then, why no one came back from this place. There was a terminal labeled PRISM-3 in the north wing, powered down and sealed beneath a heavy glass lid. Once I managed to boot it using one of the backup cores, it revealed a command interface not meant for public operations. The last user had entered a query loop 13 cycles ago, but it had never completed. The prompt blinked silently on the screen. Confirm alignment with threshold angle. Below it, a handwritten note taped to the screen read, "Do not confirm until all others have left." The system demanded a biometric key from someone named Technician H. I tried every override I knew. None worked. The system clock read 0 hours, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds. It always did. On day 6, I caught movement on the surface. Not directly, but in the periphery of the external camera feed, one that flickered with severe interference any time I tuned it to the northwest quadrant. There, for just a moment, I saw a figure walking across the sand, not toward the observatory, not away, but parallel to it. The image was distorted, but the silhouette was tall, thin, dragging something behind. I went to the upper deck to verify it with my own eyes, but when I reached the hatch, the handle was hot enough to blister my skin. I stared out through the reinforced slit and saw only brightness, an ocean of pale gold that shimmered as if alive. The sky remained frozen, but something had moved. I began to hear the hum in my dreams, a long, unbroken chord, not musical, but elemental. It had weight, it had texture, and beneath it, occasionally, came words not in English, not in any language I knew, but shaped in syllables that scratched against my spine as I woke. Each day I returned to the main console, hoping for a response, hoping someone would acknowledge the transmission I'd sent. But the channel remained silent. Occasionally, it flickered with static and light, and I began to suspect the dish wasn't transmitting upward anymore, but inward deep into the desert floor. I walked the perimeter on day 7, not far, just enough to circle the base and count the exhaust ports. I found one extra and old hatch, almost sealed with rust, half covered by sand. Its markings had been scrubbed away, and it lacked the regulation numbering of every other entrance. I made a mental note to check it later, but as I turned away, I noticed the faintest track in the sand beside it, 2 parallel lines, as if something had been dragged inside. Back inside, my headache pulsed against the base of my neck. The compound felt hotter, heavier, though the temperature gauge insisted it had dropped. I checked the sun again. It remained in the same position. No shift. No arc, just the same fixed glare hanging in the sky like the unblinking eye of a dead god. I felt the lens of the main telescope pull at me, not physically, but ideologically, gravitationally. A part of me wanted to look, to see what Technician H had recorded, but the note remained, "Don't touch the mirrors." And the mirrors, they were beginning to hum. By the 8th day, it was no longer a matter of coincidence or misunderstanding. The sun had not moved, not an inch, not a fraction of an arc. I had performed every type of calibration available to me: optical, thermal, mechanical, and the data returned the same immutable result. The celestial body positioned overhead was locked in place, unmoving, unfading, unwavering in its pressure. I tried aligning auxiliary scopes to measure angular displacement, timing the sun's passage across fixed reference points, but the outcome never changed. It remained pinned like an insect to the sky, its presence constant, its light unrelenting, its heat somehow increasing with each passing hour despite no apparent shift in position. The daylight did not evolve. It did not drift through the amber gradients of afternoon or descend into the bruised violets of twilight. It stayed pale, white, and wide, cast over everything like a fever dream stretched too long. Shadows, once sharp and obedient, now began to bend strangely around corners, curling slightly, as though reluctant to hold shape under a sun that had overstayed its welcome. The human body is not built for perpetual day. Not truly. There is a rhythm within us, a pulse of light and dark, sleep and waking, that sustains our grip on time. Here, in the unbroken blaze of this prison of illumination, I began to lose hold of that rhythm. Sleep became an act of will, not biology. I lay down because the clock suggested I should, but my body remained alert, my eyes dry and raw, my thoughts wheeling without destination. When I did sleep, It was with an oxygen mask strapped tight against my face to simulate pressure and isolation, something I remembered from deep bunker training years ago, before I washed out of the program. Even then, dreams fractured into frames of white and gold and heat, always ending with me standing under that enormous sun, mouth full of sand, tongue cracked and bleeding, speaking to someone who wasn't there. I documented each sunrise attempt, marking the moments when the horizon should have shifted, recording the flat, still edge of the desert that never changed. I sent these logs daily through the internal transmission relay. There was never a reply. The system acknowledged the send, time-stamped it, and moved on. It was like whispering into a jar and sealing it shut. I returned often to the central dome, not for work, not for purpose, but because it seemed to call me. The telescope sat like a monument, unused yet active, vibrating faintly at intervals I began to time. Every 93 minutes, precisely, the base of the instrument would emit a low, metallic groan, almost too low to register, but enough to rattle the cables strung above it. No systems powered it. No operator initiated the cycle. It simply responded to what I did not know. Perhaps the sun, perhaps something inside it. There was a mirror panel near the southern console, covered in cloth when I first arrived. I never removed the cloth, but by day 9, I noticed the edges beginning to pulse, barely perceptible ripples along the fabric, as though air moved differently in that corner. I checked for ventilation, for drafts, but found nothing. I placed a thermometer near it and left it overnight. The results made no sense. The mirror's covered surface registered cold far below ambient, as though it absorbed heat from the room rather than reflected it. The hum grew stronger at night, or what I called night, though the sky outside never dimmed. The idea of night became a construct, a necessary lie I repeated to myself in order to feel sane. I began referring to waking period and repose period in my logs. The term day no longer applied. On day 10, I discovered a sealed file on one of the backup drives, labeled iLock, password protected, but poorly. It took only a few attempts to bypass the encryption. Inside were short video files, each no more than 20 seconds long, archived from surveillance footage captured on fixed internal cams across various cycles. The earliest were mundane, technicians adjusting dials, cleaning lenses, recording solar data into worn-out notebooks. But by cycle 6, the footage took a turn. One clip showed a man standing in the middle of the central dome with his eyes open but unblinking, staring into the telescope for 11 minutes. The feed cuts before he moves. Another clip shows a woman whispering into a vent shaft for over an hour, though the audio feed picks up no voice. Only the background drone of systems I thought had long since shut down. Then came the final video labeled cycle _10_X showing a tall figure in a heat suit exiting the compound through the west access port, dragging behind him a line of reflective panels on wheels. He moves slowly, as if under orders, and stops at the edge of the visible frame, where the desert meets the false horizon. He sets the panels down in a precise patterned circular, interlinked Dan stands in the center, arms raised. The video distorts then, not from interference, but as if the image is being pulled sideways, warped by a force within the lens itself. When it returns to normal, the figure is gone. The panels remain. The sun continues to shine. I checked the west access port myself that morning. It was welded shut from the inside. I began losing words, not forgetting them, but skipping them as I spoke aloud, my own logs, marked by gaps. Moments where I meant to say equipment, but found emptiness instead. I thought of my mother during those moments, her descent into early dementia, the way she used to forget the names of things and replace them with what she feared. I ran cognitive tests. I passed them, but I no longer trusted their metrics. By day 11, the interior lighting of the compound began to behave differently. In the lower halls, some bulbs shifted color, casting green or purple hues at irregular intervals. I checked diffusers, the voltage, the line current, no fluctuation. The colors had no source. The shadows moved too, not in response to light, but independently. I tested them with flashlights. They lagged. I turned my back on one and felt it press against the soles of my boots like a liquid, trying to pull me in. I stopped using mirrors entirely. My reflection looked normal, too normal. On day 12, it blinked when I didn't. I attempted to leave. I won't lie about that. I packed what I could, programmed the exit route into the rover's GPS, and opened the north access. The light outside was intolerable. Not just bright, but louder pressure that pushed against my eardrums and scraped the back of my teeth with every breath. The air smelled wrong, like overheated metal and something organic beneath it. The scent of rot buried in a furnace. I took 3 steps outside, then 5. By the 6th step, the ground beneath me no longer felt stable. It was soft, wet, despite no signs of moisture. I looked down. My boots left no prints. I turned back. Inside the airlock, I removed my gloves and found my skin had darkened, not from sun, but from some reaction deeper than surface exposure. The dermis felt brittle, heat tripled, like glass left too long in fire. The observatory was not just watching the sun, it was part of it. Or perhaps the sun was watching back, and it had seen me. By the 13th day, I stopped trying to count days. Whatever internal clock I had been using, whatever fragile metronome still governed the concepts of before and after, had started to falter. Sleep arrived in fragments, untethered from intention, like my body was only pretending to obey natural rhythms it no longer believed in. I began finding myself in rooms I didn't remember walking into, staring at systems I didn't recall powering up, hands hovering over switches I didn't remember learning. The hum from the mirror chambers intensified, not louder, but closer, like sound carried through bones instead of air. I no longer listened with my ears. I felt with my teeth. When I spoke aloud, the echo took a fraction too long to return, as if the room had grown larger while I wasn't looking. It was during one of those blank transitions from corridor to lab that I found the silence room. The door had always been there, embedded into the north wing. But until that moment it had been sealed without a visible lock, just a metal plate engraved with 4 vertical lines. No handle, no keypad. But that day it was open. Just a sliver, enough for the air to leak out. I smelled something cold and sterile, like ozone after lightning. I pulled the door open with 2 hands and stepped inside. It was smaller than I expected, square, maybe 3 meters by 3, but impossibly quiet. Not just the absence of sound, but the removal of it, like my own footsteps had been swallowed the moment they landed. The walls were paneled with a material I didn't recognize, matte black and smooth like polished coal. The floor was padded, not in any obvious way, but with a strange give, like walking on foam that never compressed. In the center of the room was a chair not bolted down, not wired, but positioned directly beneath a dish-shaped receiver mounted into the ceiling. On the adjacent wall, a strip of text had been burned into the surface using what looked like acid etching. I leaned in to read it. Begin here. If the sky no longer blinks. I sat. At first, I heard nothing. Or rather, I heard the absence of myself, the absence of breath, of blood flow, of the subtle crackle of muscle beneath skin, the kind of silence that feels like pressure. Then, from the receiver above, came a sound not audible but undeniable, an ultra-low frequency, so deeply pitched it existed more in my spinal column than my ears. It reverberated like the memory of a voice, the ghost of a command long forgotten. And then, layered beneath it, I heard the logs. They weren't audio files, they weren't spoken words, but they were voices, impressions, dreams printed into the soundscape of that chamber like fossils in soft earth. I felt them as memories, not my own technicians, whispering in dry air, crying into their palms, speaking numbers that ended in sobs. One voice repeated the same phrase over and over. It was never meant to rise. It was meant to keep us still. I don't remember leaving the room. I only remember finding myself outside it, skin damp, hair matted with sweat, legs sore from sitting in one position too long. My voice was hoarse. I had said something aloud for hours, but the logs didn't show it. The cameras outside the door had gone dead during my time inside, a blackout that never tripped the breakers. I returned to the control center and reviewed the logbooks again, but now the words read differently, as if I had learned the language they were truly written in. Technician H had left instructions, mostly warnings disguised as procedural notes. One entry read, "Do not acknowledge the static when it mirrors your own speech. That's when it knows you're listening." Another, "If the observatory begins to echo your footsteps when you are still, evacuate." I turned on my heel then and listened. Nothing but the silence no longer comforted me. It pressed inward. The tapes marked protocol silence were kept in a drawer I had ignored for days, misreading the smudged label as something irrelevant. Inside were reels of magnetic tape, tagged with dates that didn't follow the calendar. Cycle 3B, Cycle 7R, Silence, Phase Delta. I loaded one into the playback machine in the acoustics lab. At first, it was blank, no waveform, no audio signal, but as the reel spun, colors began to change in the peripheral lights. Red to blue, blue to white. Then I heard it, the same tone from the chamber, overlaid with something else, words, not spoken, but encoded in sound. Time-stretched syllables, reversed phrases, breath patterns stretched into sentences. And underneath, a second voice that was neither male nor female, not human but not mechanical. It said only one thing: "You were not chosen, you were aligned." I stopped the tape. I erased the playback buffer. I disconnected the machine. But when I returned to my quarters, the phrase was written on the condensation inside my window. On day 14, or what I called day 14, because by now the clocks had all unsynced themselves and refused correction, I took an inventory of the mirrors. There were 6 in total, 3 freestanding, covered in cloth or sealed inside cases, 1 embedded into the southern wall of the telescope dome, 1 mounted above the entry corridor to the comms room, and 1 undocumented hidden behind a false panel in the east wing. That last one was different. Its surface was cracked, fractured from within, like something had tried to push through. The fracture lines formed a pattern, almost floral, a bloom of chaos. But if I looked long enough, I could see reflections that weren't mind-slow, delayed, with slight differences. My head tilted 1 second too late, my eyes blinking twice instead of once. I covered it again. The mirrors hummed in tandem now, synchronized. The frequencies shifted during my rest periods, always settling just outside the range of perception. I recorded them. I played them back. They were always silent on tape. But I began hearing voices even when I wasn't near them, voices in the piping, in the drone of the generators, in the cooling fans of the central system. Not language, not even sound, but memory pressed into material. I followed the humming to the access tunnel on the lower level, where I had seen the extra exhaust port. It was no longer sealed. A breeze issued from within, cool, unlike anything in the rest of the compound. It carried the scent of petrichor, of wet stone and moss, though the desert was dry as bone. I entered, crawling over collapsed ductwork and stepping past half-buried crates marked with symbols I didn't recognize. There, at the end of the tunnel, I found a hatch. It was already open, and beyond it, stairs, descending into black. I didn't descend that night. I left a marker. I returned to the main room and attempted to send another broadcast. I spoke clearly, slowly, into the receiver. This is Sol 6, technician replacement code 1431K. The sky has not changed. The mirrors are vibrating. There is movement in the static. There is something beneath the observatory. I am requesting extraction or contact. Please respond. There was no reply, but the air changed, and from the vent behind me, I heard breathing. Not mine, not human. It was on the 15th waking cycle, though that word had long since lost its precision, that I finally unearthed the complete logs of the previous occupantha, one identified only in fragments, initials, and garbled audio as Technician H. The file was not stored where protocol dictated, not in the main archive, nor within the comms terminal where daily rotations were expected to be logged. It was hidden within the optical storage locker, embedded beneath a false floor plate beneath coils of unused cabling. A compartment not visible under normal lighting, only revealed when the dome's primary lens projected a sliver of radiance at an oblique angle, an accident of observation, or a design left for someone willing to look wrong. The logs were analog. 3 binders, pages warped with heat and pressure. The ink faded in places, but legible. Each entry began with a simple mark, H, followed by a number, then a brief summary, like fragments of thought, rather than formal record. The tone changed over time. Lee entries maintained a clinical detachment, as if H still believed they were part of a system that cared, reporting to someone who might read, understand, respond. But by the middle of the second binder, that tone unraveled. The handwriting grew erratic, the phrasing less precise. There were places where entire pages were blacked out with thick ink lines, and others where the writing looped in circles, over and over, the same phrase repeated across margins and into the binding. The first notable entry read, H03, arrival, normal. Sun motion, inconsistent by 0.001 arc. Adjustment procedure failed. Discrepancy logged as sensor drift. Mirrors requested recalibration, followed by H04, shadow lag persists. Echoes in pipe 1 to be woke twice from same dream. Mirrors produce tone at rest. Then H06, telescope reflects internal temperature back into housing. Impossible, removed lens. Lens cold. I read for hours, the words crawling under my skin like ants. H had noticed the same things. The frozen sun, the refusal of clocks to behave, the movement of shadows where no movement should be. By entry H10, their thoughts had begun to fragment in structure. My own voice came from the vent. It said what I was going to say before I said it. The mirrors are not for seeing. They are for returning what does not belong. Don't speak near them. The notation system eventually collapsed entirely. The final entries no longer bore numbers. They were marked with symbol circles, downward arrows, crude eyes drawn with frantic repetition. One page bore only a single line, scribbled in a heavy hand, pressing the pen deep into the paper. There is no center to the sun. It is a mouth. It is open. Interspersed throughout the logs were sketches, some architectural, crude maps of the facility as it had been, or perhaps as it was supposed to be. One drawing depicted a section of the observatory I had never seen, a chamber far below the primary sublevel, circular in design, ringed with mirrors, labeled simply threshold. Another page bore a human silhouette drawn in profile, but elongated, stretched like heat distortion. The head tilted back and mouth open wide, with lines radiating from the eyes and tongue. Underneath, H had written, "This is what we become when we see too long." I stopped reading only when the hum returned, not distant, but immediate, like it had followed me from the mirror rooms. It came through the walls now, vibrating the shelves. I placed my hands on the binders, and the paper inside thrummed with pressure, as though the memories stored in those pages had grown restless. I carried them back to my quarters, locking them inside the metal storage trunk, where I kept personal items I no longer trusted myself to use. Among them, I added the small mirror from my shaving kit, face down, wrapped in cloth. From that point forward, I began seeing H in the periphery, not as a hallucination, but as a shape caught just before the eye adjusts. Reflections that did not match, movements in the corners of observation feeds that stopped when played back. I began recording continuously, overlaying surveillance from every hallway, storing backups redundantly. And still, he never appeared on tape. But I knew every corridor held a breath I hadn't drawn. Every time I passed the mirror near the control deck, my reflection had a tremor I hadn't made. The comms terminal glitched again that cycle, rebooting without prompt and playing back a transmission I never sent. My voice, flat and calm, speaking words I did not recall. Cycle alignment complete. Observation maintained. The sun listens when we do not speak. The system flagged the message as incoming, not outgoing. I returned to the telescope. The dome had grown warmer again, despite no increase in external temperature. I traced my fingers along the edge of the housing, felt static build under my skin. The metal was alive, not figuratively, not metaphorically. It pulsed with a rhythm too regular for coincidence. It was breathing. I ran a thermal sweep and found hotspots across the array, not aligned with any mechanical function. A pattern emerged, 3 points forming a triangle, pulsing in sync with the hum, pointing directly at a fixed point beneath the facility, the same point H had labeled threshold. I went back to the binders, desperate for instruction. One final entry, tucked in the back cover of the last book, had no date, no marking, only a sentence. You cannot record what does not wish to be remembered. Beneath it, another hand sloppier urgent had written, "Do not look through the lens when the sky speaks your name." I searched every audio log for my name. None. Then I replayed the files from the silence room, slowed them, reversed them, filtered them through old decryption algorithms designed for Cold War numbers stations. On the last pass, buried beneath layers of static and compression, I heard it my name, not spoken, but exhaled, not in a human voice, just a shape formed from breath. I stood in the mirror hall again that night. I uncovered the smallest panel, just for a moment. My reflection was there, but off, the angle of the shoulders wrong, the eyes unfocused, the mouth half open as if it were waiting to speak, but I wasn't. And as I moved, the reflection remained still for a full second too long. The observatory had begun to mimic. I returned to the hatch in the floor of the tunnel. The air below was colder now, sharper, filled with the scent of iron and deep earth. I descended 2 steps, then 3. The metal groaned underfoot. Something shifted in the walls, like gears turning after years of stillness. And faintly, from far below, a voice not H's, not mine, called a word I hadn't heard in years. My father's name. I climbed back up. I sealed the hatch. Back in my quarters, I found the binder open, though I hadn't touched it. A page I hadn't seen before now lay exposed. The drawing showed the observatory split in half, hollow inside, and within its core was an eye, lidless, round, and burning with lines like cracks across its surface. Around it were figures kneeling, but not facing it. They knelt outward, as if shielding it from sight. And beneath it, he who sees becomes what sees. I locked the logs again, but it didn't matter. I had read enough. and I was beginning to understand. Technician H had never left the observatory. He had become it. I began marking time by shadows instead of clocks, or more precisely, by their refusal to behave. Every known system of measurement had failed. My digital timers stalled. Analog needles jittered or spun freely on their axles, and even my own breath seemed to shift cadence in ways that didn't match effort or exertion. But shadows told a kind of truth, even if it was an alien one. They stopped obeying the shape of my body, no longer mimicking arms or legs with fidelity. Instead, they began to soften, bend, delay. I could hold out my hand under a fixed light source and see 5 fingers in flesh, and 4 on the floor. Once, I watched a shadow detach slightly from its owner, a tool cart I hadn't moved, and then lag behind as I wheeled it across the lab. A 2-second delay, like the light was catching up to something else. Outside, the desert held its breath. 11 cycles without dusk. No twilight, no shifting hues. The sun remained where it had anchored itself, high enough to keep the sky blinding, low enough to cast the world in perpetual horizontal glare. Everything looked bleached. The sand reflected too much light, and I began seeing retinal ghosts even with my eyes closed. Long red tunnels of color burned into the backs of my lids. When I blinked, they flickered like after images from a camera flash that never went off. There was no night, no darkness, just this slow boiling of everything beneath an uncaring furnace. The observatory's cooling systems began to fail in sections. Some rooms became ovens, electronics warping, casing deforming, wires hissing softly before splitting their insulation and bleeding copper. Other sections grew cold without reason, as if heat had fled entirely. The hallway leading to the communications annex dropped 10 degrees overnight. I could see my breath there, but nowhere else. I sealed it with magnetic sheeting and stopped checking the terminal. No one was listening anyway. And when the speakers crackled back, no longer static, but the dry whisper of wind or words I found I didn't want to hear anymore. By the 12th waking, the plant I kept in my quarters had died, not slowly, but all at once. A small succulent, meant to survive anything, withered to grey in a single afternoon. Its leaves became brittle in my fingers, hollow like it had been drained from within. I ran a soil analysis, but it returned null readings. No moisture, no pH, as if it had never held life at all. I placed its remains in the disposal unit and left the quarters sealed for the remainder of the cycle. The mirrors, still covered, began to vibrate audibly during quiet hours, not constant, but rhythmically like breath. They pulsed in groups of 3, and each wave seemed to correspond with fluctuations in the base's main generator. I could time the dimming of the overhead lights with the mirror's resonance. I logged it, graphed it, correlated it. But I knew, deep down, that these things weren't reacting to power. They were exerting it. The observatory no longer consumed electricity in the traditional sense. It redirected something unseen, pulling from outside the known spectrum, feeding on it like a lung pulls air. I found the second access hatch to the sublevels during a systems check on the geothermal conduits. It wasn't marked on any blueprint. A cold lock chamber embedded behind an old supply shelf, its keypad scorched and its hinges melted inward. It had been sealed deliberately, but something inside had clawed out. Not literal claw marks, no teeth, no nails, but gouges in the steel that spiraled inward, as though the door had been twisted open by sound, or force, or pressure so deep it bypassed material altogether. I didn't open it that day. I stared at the handle, touched the cold seam of its frame, and walked away. The reflections continued to act strange. On day 13, I caught mine blinking while I stared. No delay, just wrong. The sequence of motion inverted, like watching myself in a poorly rendered simulation. And once, In the central lens chamber, I passed by the uncovered mirror without meaning to. My reflection turned to face me a full second before my body did. I sealed that room, shut off the lights, wrote "Do not open" on the outer panel, not for anyone else, but for myself, for the version of me that might forget. I spoke less and less in my logs. Words began to lose meaning when you had no one to address them to. The microphone became a kind of ritual object. I whispered into it as one might into a grave. On the 14th waking, I played back an old log, hoping for something human in my voice, some memory of structure, of rhythm, of identity. But the playback sounded like someone else entirely. My voice. Yes, but deeper, drier, as though speaking through layers of gauze. I shut it off. I didn't try again. The telescope focused itself during one of my sleep intervals. I awoke to find it tracking the sun not in its movement, but in its stillness. It had recalibrated to focus on a fixed point in the corona, not the center, but slightly off, a sunspot that pulsed with a regular frequency. I tried to interrupt it, disengage the lock, but the manual override resisted me, not mechanically, biologically. My hands trembled when they touched the levers. My muscles refused to obey, like my body knew something my mind had not yet admitted. I heard singing that night, not in any language, not with any voice, just pitch, melody, droning in perfect intervals. It came through the ventilation, through the cracks in the foundation. I followed it into the old audio lab, where the silence recorders used to be kept. On a hunch, I activated the bone mic array field experiment, long deprecated for its instability, and I heard it. Full spectrum resonance. Layered harmonics, each wave carrying a signature that did not match any known source. I played it through a modulation deck. The harmonics formed shapes, peaks, valleys, eyes. They were maps. Starless constellations drawn not in space, but in sound. And then I heard my name again, once, very clear, very gentle, as though spoken not to me, but around me. I disabled the equipment. I returned to the silence room, sat beneath the dish. The voice returned, never louder than a whisper in the spine. And it said something new this time. You were almost prepared. I cried, then, not out of fear, but because I understood that I would not return, that something within the observatory was changing me subtly, deeply, irrevocably, that the thing the mirrors were humming to, the sun that did not move, the echoes in the walls, the mouth beneath the telescope, these were not anomalies, they were instructions, and I was beginning to follow them. On the 15th cycle, I opened the second hatch, and I began to descend. There was no reason to return to the surface, no logic in standing beneath that unmoving sun again, but something pulled me upward the same way one touches a flame twice to confirm it burns. I had descended into the hatch beneath the observatory, stared into the throat of whatever waited below, but instead of relief or understanding, I felt that same pressure against my back, like a hand without fingers, pushing gently, constantly. The interior of Sol 6 had grown quieter since I had opened the second access. Not peaceful, not still, just quieter, as if the facility itself had turned inward, holding its breath. Even the hum of the mirrors, which had once matched the rhythm of my heartbeat so precisely that I began to mistake it for my own pulse, had grown softer, more restrained, as if waiting for something to change. I needed a fixed point, a landmark, something above the madness that had grown roots in the soil below. That's why I climbed the western access stairs that morning, the ones that led to the external observation deck, a narrow catwalk once used for atmospheric calibration. The door at the top was rusted but not locked. I hadn't opened it since my arrival, hadn't trusted myself to stand in the full glare of a sun that hadn't blinked in over a week. But that day, I needed to see. I needed proof of reality, even if it melted the inside of my skull. The door swung wide with a metallic shriek that echoed into the desert, louder than it should have been, far too loud in a world where sound had become so shy. The light hit me like a weapon, dry, directionless, diffused through the thin clouds that refused to move, washing the entire horizon in a white-gold haze that left no contrast, no boundary. The landscape was familiar in its broad shape, but alien in texture. The sand had hardened, not crusted, but vitrified, glazed like the surface of a kiln. It shimmered even when still, and when I leaned over the railing and peered down, I saw reflections where there should have been shadows. A desert of mirrors. Then I looked west. The watchtower wasn't supposed to be there. No maps had shown it. No logs mentioned its construction. It was distant, half swallowed by a dune, skeletal and rusted like something forgotten, but unmistakably artificial. A narrow structure of blackened steel, not tall 3 stories, at most, but impossibly thin, like a needle forced into the earth. Its silhouette shimmered slightly in the heat, but it did not waver, and it cast no shadow. There was a figure standing in it, not pacing, not signaling, just standing, arms at their sides, posture straight. They stood on the highest platform, gazing into the horizon, back turned to me, unmoving. I watched for what felt like 10 minutes. No shift in weight, no flicker of clothing in the wind. I raised the rangefinder I had brought up from the supply closet and zoomed. The lens crackled. Static danced across the screen, but I saw enough. The figure was tall, wearing a standard issue technician's suit, charcoal grey, thermally lined, model discontinued at least 5 years ago. The kind worn by Technician H in the archival photos. I whispered his name without meaning to. The figure did not move. I tried the radio. No response. I tried the beacon channel. Nothing. I checked the solar relay to see if it registered heat from that quadrant. No signature. No anomaly. As far as the base was concerned, that tower didn't exist. I stayed for another 10 minutes, watching. The longer I stared, the more I noticed the subtle wrongness. The figure's proportions were slightly off, arms, a touch too long, neck angled slightly backward, and the platform on which he stood appeared corroded, unfit to bear weight. Rust had eaten half the beams, and yet he stood, proud still, focused on the distance, or perhaps on nothing at all. Then he moved, not turned, not waved, just shifted. He stepped off the edge. I gasped, stepped back instinctively, but there was no fall, no descent, no impact. He simply vanished, erased from space, not swallowed by gravity. One moment there, the next, the platform was empty. I scanned the tower with frantic urgency, every window, every stairwell, every jagged opening. Nothing. Then I saw him again, not in the tower, but nearer, closer to the facility, standing beside a formation of half-buried solar panels 50 meters from the perimeter fence, still turned away, still unmoving. I bolted down the stairs, nearly losing footing on the hot metal steps, and sprinted through the base toward the viewing window in the mess hall, the only place that looked west unimpeded. When I arrived, I saw nothing. The figure was gone, but the solar panels had shifted, just slightly. Their alignment had changed, as if moved by a human hand. A subtle arc traced in the dust, footsteps half formed and then erased. I didn't sleep that cycle. Instead, I rewound every exterior feed. No entry through the gates, no motion near the base, and yet the footprints remained. The alignment of the panels had altered. I checked the power log. The draw from those panels had increased by 7%. They were now feeding the system directly. I reviewed the binders again, desperate for a connection. Near the back of H's second binder was a page I had overlooked torn along one edge, half soaked in something sticky. The sketch was crude, childlike. A spire in the desert, a figure standing atop it, arms outstretched, and a series of lines drawn downward, connecting it to a sun with a mouth. Beneath it, he watches from the point of calibration. He was the first to understand the function of stillness. Later, in the hallway, I saw him again. Not in the flesh, not directly, just in the reflection of a power panel, his silhouette flickering in the steel casing like a glitch in glass. I turned fast. Nothing. I stared into the panel again. My own reflection looked back, except my head tilted, ever so slightly, out of sync with the motion. I sealed that corridor, added it to the growing list of areas marked unsafe for solo entry. At 4:02, an arbitrary time I noted by my last functioning wristwatch, I received an incoming transmission. The terminal crackled to life, speakers wheezing out static like an exhale from something that had been holding breath for centuries. Then a voice, faint, familiar. "You are not the first. You are not alone. You are the next." The voice was mine, but not from me. I shut down the terminal, removed its power core, threw the drive into the incinerator. The following morning, whatever that meant, now I returned to the catwalk. The tower was gone, not collapsed, not destroyed, gone. Only the sand remained, smooth and untouched, as if nothing had ever stood there. But the panels still drew power. The mirrors still hummed. And in the lens chamber, the telescope was now pointing northeast, locked on a new point, one I hadn't assigned. And the reflection in the auxiliary lens watched me approach with a patience I had never learnt. From somewhere within the observatory's walls, a tone began to play, low, rhythmic, familiar, like breathing, waiting to become speech. It began subtly, just a flicker, a skip in the broadcast log, a phantom time stomp where no message had been sent. I had left the receiver tuned to channel 7C, an old maintenance frequency once used for environmental sensor reports. It had been dormant since my arrival, producing nothing but occasional bursts of static shaped more by atmospheric interference than any meaningful transmission. I monitored it out of habit, perhaps out of a desire to simulate order amid the chaos that had slowly hollowed out the rhythm of my days. But, on what I counted as the 17th cycle, a new sound emerged. Not a voice, not music, something in between. At first, I thought it was interference from the solar flare monitors. Occasionally, the dish arrays would pick up residual echoes from ionization bursts, particularly when sunspots aligned with the upper quadrant of the sky. But there had been no sunspot activity in nearly 4 rotations, not that I could measure properly anymore. The instruments gave contradictory readings. Thermal values dropped while visual brightness increased. Radiation meters flatlined and then spiked without cause. One reported an impossible result, negative light, as if the sun was emitting not just heat, but shadow. The new signal was low, just above the threshold of human hearing. I recorded the waveform and ran it through a basic spectrogram filter. What emerged sent a chill into the deepest part of me. The pattern wasn't random. It was rhythmic, repeating every 47 seconds, with a distinct shift in frequency every 6th iteration. I couldn't identify the pattern's source. The signal originated not from any known satellite or tower, but directly from the solar direction. Not bounced, not relayed, emitted. I triangulated it 3 times, using different equipment each time. The source remained the same, the exact coordinates of the sun's center, or what we thought was its center, though I had long stopped believing in what the models claimed. I opened the logs of previous operators, dug deep into cycles dating back more than 2 decades. None of them recorded a transmission like this. Not Technician H, not the teams before him. But that wasn't entirely true. One entry, buried in the file header of an unindexed audio file, contained a phrase, "Channel 5C speaks when the mirrors align." It was a line I had seen scrawled in one of H's notebooks, but dismissed as metaphor. Now it felt like protocol. I rerouted all available processing power to decrypt the modulation. It took 6 hours of raw computational grinding. I watched the algorithm struggle, loop, rewrite itself in desperation. Then, as if unlocking a code not meant to be solved by silicon or electricity, it returned a raw output, my own voice, whispering. I played it back 10 times. Each time it was unmistakable. My vocal pattern, my cadence, my inflection. But the message wasn't one I had ever spoken. It said only 3 words. "I remember you." I shut down the system. But the signal didn't stop. It began to mirror me. Not just the words I spoke, but the way I moved. I would cough, and the channel would produce a faint, delayed echo of the sound. I would tap the desk, and a moment later, I'd hear the same rhythm played back, like sonar in reverse. The observatory had become a chamber, and the sun was answering. Not with knowledge, but with familiarity, recognition, as though it had been listening longer than I'd been speaking, perhaps even before I arrived. On cycle 18, I connected the solar array directly to the audio processing grid, bypassing all filters, all encryption, all safeties. I wanted to hear the signal as it was raw, unshaped by interpretation. The sound that emerged was not one sound, but many, layers, depths, chords that played across dimensions. At first, it resembled music, then language, then something older than both. A voice made of pressure and decay, a whisper not carried by air, but by memory, and beneath it all, a constant beat, not mechanical, organic, a heartbeat. I tried recording it. The data refused to stay intact. Files corrupted themselves the moment they were saved. The waveform collapsed into straight lines. Storage mediums cracked, or sparked, or froze. I managed to preserve one fragment for seconds by routing the signal into a looped analog reel-to-reel tape recorder I'd salvaged from the archives. The reel hissed when touched, radiated heat, and the metal began to warp after a single playback. I transcribed the audio by hand, word by broken word. You are not hearing, you are remembering. I had stopped speaking aloud to myself by then. Silence had become my companion, my only ritual. I wrote in notebooks instead, hundreds of pages scrawled with symbols, attempts to chart the frequency modulations like weather patterns. But there was no weather. The outside world remained fixed. The sun hung in place, unblinking, and the wind moved only when I did, as though the atmosphere no longer belonged to nature, but to me. I began to receive messages through the walls, not through wires or radios, through resonance. A screwdriver left near the mirror chamber would vibrate in Morse patterns. The floor tiles in the Combs Bay clicked like knuckles tapping out letters. I set up a crude detection grid using paper, ink, and Pinzan old method of visualizing vibration, and, within a day, the marks on the page began to form words. The sky hears you. The lens sees you. The mirrors remember. I no longer knew what part of me remained untouched. My dreams had ceased to be mine. I slept less, but when I did, I awoke standing, or kneeling, or writing on walls I had not noticed before. On the outer bulkhead of the mirror vault, I found my handwriting etched into the steel knot, scratched, but burned, as if my thoughts had transmuted themselves into heat. I stopped fighting it. The signal evolved again on the 20th cycle. It now carried data, packets, compressed streams of what appeared to be visual information, frame sequences encoded into sound. I decoded them using software meant for lunar telemetry, a program never intended for this purpose. What I saw chilled me more than the voice had. Images of the observatory, from above, from impossible heights, from directly overhead, a perspective we had no satellite capable of maintaining for so long. And in those images, I was present. I saw myself standing on the roof. I saw myself staring up at the sun. I saw myself from angles that could not exist. One frame showed me lying in my bunk, eyes open, mouth forming a word I didn't remember speaking. Another showed me standing before the sealed hatch, but with something behind me, tall, wide, unformed, a shadow without a source. I shut down the processing grid, tore the cables out with my bare hands, threw them into the incinerator and locked the door. The signal kept playing, and now it didn't wait for equipment. I heard it in the vents, in the water pipes, in the rattle of my own teeth. The channel had become part of the structure, part of me. I tried to flee that night, packed what little I still trusted Map's tools, water and headed for the outer gate. The sun was still in place, fixed and cruel. The desert stretched ahead like a scar, pale and grinning. I walked 20 paces from the threshold. The signal followed me. From the sand came the vibration, through my boots, into my legs, into the hollows of my spine. A word formed in the marrow of me, not in sound, not in thought, in certainty. You are inside now. I turned back, and from the far end of the desert, where no towers should have stood, I saw a light, red, pulsing, waiting. The observatory had tuned itself to me, and now so had the sun. It began in the floor. I would feel it at first only in passing an uneven step, a gentle vibratory buzz through the soles of my boots, the faint suggestion that something moved beneath the base, too deep and too slow to be machinery. I had grown used to the sounds of Celsix's internal life, the dry cough of failing ventilation, the click-hiss of thermal regulators struggling to maintain equilibrium in rooms that no longer obeyed the rules of heat and cold, the dull tremor of wind through reinforced steel that often sounded like distant speech. But this was different. It came not through the walls or ducts or cables, but from beneath the structure itself, from somewhere far below the lowest registered floor, deeper than any blueprint acknowledged. It was not a tremor, it was a rhythm, it was summoning. I tracked the vibrations obsessively, crawling through conduits, pressing my ear against cold tile and ancient steel, tracing paths through rooms I had sealed off long ago, sections that no longer felt entirely part of this world. The signals followed no clear pattern, but they always circled the same area, a quadrant in the southeast corner of sublevel 4, long collapsed from disuse and heat warping. I had avoided it until then, trusting the structural warnings, but something about the pull of those vibrations became irresistible. It was not curiosity, it was obligation. I cleared the rubble with my hands, bruising fingers against jagged aluminum, scraping skin raw against paneling that bled rust. Behind a wall of broken shelving and collapsed ducting, I uncovered an access panel I hadn't seen in any file. The door had no digital lock, no seal, just a triangular indentation where a handle should have been. I pressed my palm to the metal. It was warmer than any room in the facility, and not with sun-heated air, but with something internal, something awake. The door opened soundlessly. Behind it, a shaft descended at an angle, narrow and steep, lined with corrugated plating that shimmered faintly even in darkness. There were no lights, no handrails, no signs, just a slope into silence, like an artery carved from the bones of the earth. I brought a lantern, analog, battery-fed, the kind you keep for atmospheric breaches or electrical surges. As I stepped into the passage, the light flickered once and then stabilized, but not before revealing something scratched into the inner walls. A spiral, repeated endlessly, carved with something blunt and desperate. Each loop of the spiral ended in a single word, etched smaller and smaller until it could not be seen. Come. I walked downward for what must have been an hour, maybe more. The angle of descent remained constant, neither accelerating nor easing, and there was no sound beyond my breath and the crunch of grit beneath my steps. Occasionally the walls shuddered, not from movement, but from pressure, like they were containing something, like they were holding breath. My lantern dimmed as I passed a certain depth, no change in battery, no environmental interference. The light simply lessened, as though it was no longer welcome. At the end of the descent, I reached a vault, circular, hollow, vast, a chamber buried in silence. Its walls lined with concentric rings of blackened mirrors, identical in shape and size to those above, but aged, fractured in their glass, spider-webbed with hairline cracks that reflected nothing, not my face, not my light, not even the room. They swallowed illumination. My lantern became a cold orb in the center of a void, casting no beam, revealing only the contours of the floor beneath me. A spiral again, this one etched in brass, leading to the center of the chamber, where a single chair stood. The chair faced upward, not toward a ceiling, but toward the same artificial dome mirrored in the observatory's surface. Above, except this one, contained no telescope, no lens, no opening, just more mirrors. Infinite depth, as though if one sat and looked long enough, one would see through time itself, or be seen. There was a journal on the chair, bound in cracked leather, edges curled, pages stained with salt and dust. It had no name, no date, no number. The first page bore only a phrase: threshold achieved. Observation has ended. Integration begins. The rest of the entries there were hundreds, were all written in the same hand, but the language shifted. At first, English, disjointed, obsessive, repetitive, descriptions of sound, of light, of voices heard in dreamless sleep, mentions of cycles, of alignment, of something called the chamber of becoming. Then, partway through, the words stopped making sense. Sentences looped, letters reversed. And then came the symbols, geometric, crystalline, like maps of things that could not exist in space, but only in memory. Interlaced diagrams of mirrored spires. Notes written in lines so small they blurred together like the grooves of a vinyl record. I turned the last page. It bore only a reflection. Not mine. Something else. A shape too tall, too thin, too curved to be human. It moved when I didn't. I closed the journal. The air in the chamber shifted, like lungs exhaling after holding for centuries. Then came the voice. Not in my ears, not in the room. Inside me. You heard the hum. Now hear the name. I staggered back. My breath caught. I tried to speak, but no sound emerged. You came by path. That was permitted. You saw the shape. That was intention. You sat beneath the dome. You stood before the lens. You opened the second gate. And now you listen. I fell to my knees, hands over my ears, though they did nothing. The sound wasn't sonic. It was ancestral, like memory blooming from the marrow. This place is the echo of a signal that was sent before fire, before flesh, before the orbit of things. We do not come. We are remembered, and you have remembered well. I dropped the journal. I fled. Up the spiral, stumbling, lantern dead, visions smeared by tears that weren't mine. My fingers bled against the walls as I climbed, dragging myself toward light that did not exist, toward the idea of escape. At the threshold, the passage sealed behind Minart, with sound or motion, but with closure, like a thought forgotten mid-sentence. I collapsed in the sublevel corridor, woke hours later. The journal was gone. My hands bore spiral scars, tiny, burned into the skin, as if I had held a pattern too long. The mirrors in the upper levels no longer hummed, they pulsed, and in the main control chamber the signal was waiting, not a broadcast. A reply, the call from below, had been answered, and the voice it returned was mine. It took me 3 full cycles to gather the courage to return to the vault, and even then it wasn't courage but compulsion disguised as will. The quiet pressure behind the ribs that whispered not in words but in inevitability. Nothing above had changed. The sun remained frozen in its sterile arc, casting pale light with the texture of ash. The mirrors still pulsed with a resonance I could feel in the hollows of my teeth. And the signal, now constant, no longer sought to communicate, but simply to be. It existed the way wind exists across stone, reshaping not by intent, but by duration. The observatory had entered a new rhythm, no longer humming with anticipation, but singing in slow, layered chords. And I was beginning to hear the melody clearly. The rooms no longer felt distinct from one another. Passageways folded inward. I found myself emerging from doors I hadn't entered, standing in places I had sealed, hearing conversations I had never recorded. Time, once broken, was now melting. The hallway to the lower vault had reshaped itself. I noticed this not from direct change, but from how my body reacted. The angle of descent was shallower, the path longer, the walls smoother than before. There were no more etchings, no spirals, no claw marks of desperate hands. Instead, the metal seemed to shimmer faintly with heat, though the air remained cold. As I stepped downward, I felt each moment stretch, as if walking were being redefined as falling except horizontally. I counted my steps, 43. Then I counted again, 60. Then 12. I stopped counting. The act became meaningless. The vault was darker than before, not with shadow, but with a thickness in the air, a saturation of space that clung to light and voice alike. I brought no lantern. It would have been irrelevant. The chamber saw without it. At its center, the chair was gone. In its place stood a pillar, slender, featureless, obsidian, and it pulsed faintly with the same rhythm that governed the mirrors. Its surface shimmered with impossible reflections, not of me, not of the room, but of places I had never seen. A shoreline under twin moons, a corridor made of bone, a field of antennae swaying under a black sky where stars blinked in rhythms I could almost translate. Each image flickered for only a second, as if the pillar existed not here, not now, but in a corridor of moments too dense to move through. I stepped closer. The floor underfoot no longer responded like metal or earth. It rippled faintly, as though my weight distorted something deeper than surface. The spiral pattern had changed, less geometric, more organic, a series of overlapping curves that bent toward the pillar like gravity had forgotten its own direction. I extended a hand toward the surface. It did not feel cold, it felt aware, and when my fingertips touched it, I was no longer in the vault. Not fully. I saw Solsix from above, from orbit, though I was not in space. I saw the dunes around it, shifting in impossible patterns, forming glyphs that disappeared when viewed directly. I saw the interior architecture laid bare, each room, not as I remembered it, but as it remembered itself, older, larger, recursive. The facility was not a construct. It was a lens, a machine not for seeing, but for being seen. It focused observation like heat, and I was its filament. I felt time slide, not forward, not back, sideways. Memories that were not mine flooded inward. A woman in 1973 waking beneath the dome and screaming at her reflection. A team in 1986 staring into a mirror until their bodies liquefied without sound. A technician in 2001 muttering numbers into the vent system until he ceased to exist in any recorded file, leaving only a smudge in the floor shaped like a name. Each fragment, ended in light. Each moment dissolved into the same frequency I had heard in my own voice weeks before. I pulled back. The pillar retracted slightly into the floor, acknowledging the interruption. On the far wall, a new passage had opened, not carved, not designed, simply permitted. I entered. The space beyond was not built. It was grown. Walls pulsed with a slow heartbeat, not meat, not stone, something in between. Veins of faint light traveled across the ceiling in pulse rhythms I instinctively understood, though they conveyed no language. The deeper I walked, the more the rules of space loosened. I turned a corner and saw the same corridor again. I passed a vent that exhaled my own breath. The air smelled of ozone and my childhood bedroom. And everywhere, beneath it all, the same tone, constant, pure, identical to the one that had emerged from the mirrors, from the signal, from the first hum I'd heard in the walls my first night on site. The corridor ended in a chamber smaller than the vault, barely 2 meters across, shaped like a tear. At its center was a pool, shallow, black, perfectly still. On the wall behind it, a message written in no ink, no paint, just presence. The sun does not rise. The sun is what remains when time collapses. I leaned over the pool. It reflected nothing. Not me, not the room, just possibility. I felt myself tilting, and for one terrible moment I was falling again, as I had on the stairs. Only now there was no descent, only surrender. Then the water shifted, and I saw myself, not now, not here, standing in the tower that no longer existed, facing the lens of the telescope, smiling. Behind me, in the vision, a shadow taller than the sky bent inward, its limbs shaped like spires, its mouth like the sun. I watched as my mirrored self turned and walked into it. I screamed. I recoiled. The image shattered. The pool boiled. The room pulsed once, and the floor fell away. I awoke in my quarters, clothed, unharmed, alone. The walls had changed. Subtly, a degree of curvature that hadn't existed, a hum that never stopped. The time on my clock read 12:12. It did not move. I went to the telescope chamber. It was gone. In its place, a flat plane of mirrors, curved like a lens, pulsing with the same beat as the pillar. The observatory had completed its purpose. It was no longer a station. It was a memory loop, a basement that melted time, and I was its proof. The names were never on the rosters. No entry logs recorded their presence. No thermal sensors mapped their footsteps through the compound. But I knew they had been here. I had seen the fragment smudges on corners of door frames, handprints on mirror glass that did not match my own, notes left in handwriting that flickered between the familiar and the impossible. They were never introduced to me, not in voice or face or silhouette, and yet I knew them. The observatory remembered them, and now, so did I. I began to call them the Daylight Crew, not because they worked while the sun was up, since the sun had not set since my arrival, but because they had once belonged to a time when day still meant something, before the melt, before the freeze, before the observatory opened its lens not just outward to the stars, but inward to the self. The Daylight Crew was never seen, only glimpsed in the seams between reflections, in the flicker of mirrored surfaces when I passed too quickly, in the breath that fogged a vent screen I had not touched. I thought at first that I was seeing echoes of myself, or worse, the projections of a mind breaking under pressure, but their movements were too structured, too familiar. They walked the same halls, they reached for the same levers, they hesitated before the same mirrors. They were not ghosts, they were residuals. I found their quarters sealed off in the West Wing rooms I had dismissed as collapsed or irrelevant. One door, previously jammed, opened with no effort. The air behind it was stale, untouched, but not empty. For bunks, for lockers, for data pads left on bedside stands, their screens blank but warm to the touch. No names, no logs, but the beds were made, the linens crisp, the small personal touches photographs turned inward. A cup with dried tea residue, a uniform jacket folded to precisely to be mine spoke of occupancy, recent, intentional. And then I saw the photo. It had fallen behind one of the bunks, wedged in the thin crack between wall and frame. The image was grainy, sun-bleached, but clear enough. 5 figures in Sol 6 uniforms, standing beneath the observatory dome. 4 smiled, 1 did not. The one in the center, the one whose face was my own. I dropped the photo. When I picked it up again, the faces had changed. All of them were looking away. That same day of day could still be said to pass. I began finding scraps of a recording scattered through the compound. Not full files, not coherent entries, just partial playbacks, embedded in random machines. A snippet of audio playing through the intercom as I passed the mess hall. A broken frame of video stuttering on a dormant screen. The fragments always contained the same moment. The crew standing in the telescope chamber, mirrors uncovered, light flooding in like seawater through a ruptured hull. They stood in formation, still, eyes wide, and the video always cut off at the same second, just before they moved toward the light. I tried isolating the source. I traced cables through panels, dismantled fuse boxes, rewired the mainframe bypass just to trace the origin of the signal. Each time I reached the source, it had already moved, like it was dodging my awareness. A voice not recorded, but real whispered once from inside the maintenance tunnel near hydroponics. They didn't leave, they folded. That word folded stayed with me, not bent, not broken, folded, as in dimensions, as in paper, as in maps, redrawn in tighter loops. It explained what I began to see next. At 3:13 meaningless time, Arbitrary now opened the closet in the optics lab and found a coat I had never worn, smeared in red dust. A brand of dust not native to this desert. One pocket contained a pen. My name was etched along its barrel. I didn't recognize the model. I didn't recognize the handwriting. But when I held it, I felt a sudden vertigo, like I had stood there before, in this same position, watching a younger version of myself find it and wonder the same things. Memory bled across layers. I sat down and wept without understanding why. Then the mirrors began to show the crew. Not all at once, just glimpses, a shoulder, a foot, the back of a head stepping out of view. In one case, I saw 3 figures gathered in the reflection of the south corridor panel. I turned nothing behind me. I turned back, only myself, but I knew they had been there. I felt the disturbance in the air, the pressure of their presence. One of them had written on the fogged glass of the chamber door, a single phrase, "Turn off the signal before you speak your name again." I didn't obey. I kept transmitting, kept logging, but the logs began to echo before I wrote them. I'd open a new entry only to find my thoughts already typed. Time no longer flowed forward. It wrapped around me. The daylight crew had not vanished. They had completed their rotation. And now their tasks were mine. In the basement, the one that melts time, I heard the crew whispering, not with mouths, with steps. Each footfall echoed longer than physics allowed, rebounding off walls that flexed with memory. I followed them one cycle, walked behind them through a passage that had no origin. I never saw them, but I heard their breath, synchronized with mine. I walked with them for what felt like hours until I passed a mirror too slowly. In its surface, 5 reflections walked together. One turned to look at me. Its face flickered like a candle behind glass. It was me. It was not me. When I returned to the upper levels, The mirrors no longer showed my current face. They showed me smiling in ways I had never smiled, crying in uniforms I had never worn, a version of me asleep in a bed I had never used. One mirror showed me standing at the watchtower window, bleeding from the eyes. I stopped checking the mirrors. I began seeing names on the terminals. Artmanancello, Ramirezan, T. Holt. No first names, no ranks, but always followed by a word. Returned, not dead, not missing, returned. I dug back into the old manifest. There were no such personnel in the official records. I checked every archive, every backup, but in one of the sealed boxes I had refused to open until now, I found a dog tag, Ramirez, no rank, no blood type. The back had a single word etched in shallow strokes, receiver. The daylight crew were not explorers. They were not technicians. They were vessels, vessels of light, vessels of memory, vessels for whatever had come before me and would come after. Now I feel them constantly. They walk behind me. They breathe through me. When I sleep, I wake in other rooms. When I dream, I see through their eyes. When I speak, sometimes the voice is not mine. I am becoming one of them. I do not know if I am the last, but I know I am no longer first. And if this message ever reaches UF, anything I have recorded survives this place. Know this, the observatory never loses its crew. It keeps them, and they wait for you. It was near the end of the 23rd waking when the mirrors fell silent. Not silent in the conventional sense. They had never been loud, but absent. The subtle pulse that had once aligned itself to my breath, the low harmonic that wove itself between the ticks of failed clocks, the resonance that sat behind every word I spoke or heard it, was gone. And in its absence, a void larger than noise took its place. At first I mistook the quiet for peace, for the lull that comes before restoration. But this was not peace. This was attention. It felt as if every wall had turned inward to stare, and the facility itself, now more organism than architecture, held its breath, not in anticipation but in observation. I wandered the halls in this hush, moving slowly, unsure if my footsteps still belonged to me. Lights remained steady, a rarity I should have welcomed, but their steadiness felt wrong now, too artificial, too deliberate, as if someone else had set the mood before I arrived. I drifted toward the upper dome, not out of purpose, but habit. It had become my orbit, that place once sacred for its scientific instruments, and now hallowed for the weight of what it revealed. The telescope had long since ceased to function as designed. It no longer pointed where, I asked. It no longer collected data. It did not even hum. It simply watched, and I had become its most regular subject. Yet, when I entered the dome this time, the lens had changed. The aperture, once sealed by mechanical arms, was now wide open, its cap retracted without command, revealing a gleaming circle of glass that no longer reflected the sun above but something else, something deeper, like the underside of still water. I approached, heart thudding. For the first time, I did not see my reflection. I saw the inside of the observatory mirrored back at me, but older, darker, layered in dust and decay. My movements did not match. My head tilted while I stood still. My hands in the mirror lifted while mine remained at my sides. My reflection blinked and I did not. I stepped back, not in fear, but with the solemnity of one approaching a grave. Then I circled the lens, moving slowly around its rim, eyes tracing the welds, the bolts, the seams of metal that had been welded and re-welded over the decades. And there, behind it, half buried in a collapsed panel I had never noticed before, I saw the edge of an inscription. The panel had once been part of the stabilization casing redundant, no longer attached to any live system. I pried it open with gloved hands, flakes of oxidized metal cutting across my knuckles. the air behind it stale and dry, untouched for who knew how long. A slab of black steel sat embedded into the back of the lens mount, curved to fit the mirror's concave shape. At first it looked blank, but under angled light, lines emerged not carved, not painted but burned, seared into the surface with a precision that felt biological. No language I knew, not at first. Just loops and intersections, lines arranged in patterns that hurt the eyes when stared at too long. But as I tilted my head, as I shifted perspective, something in the inscription unfolded. It began to make sense. Symbols became syllables. Syllables formed rhythm. The message did not translate into words exactly, it became realization. It bypassed cognition. It settled into bone. He who looks becomes the lens. I reeled back, struck by the intimacy of it. Not a warning, not a threat, a law. Something older than language. The lens was not for viewing. It was not passive. It was not a tool. It was an aperture, yes, but not for sight. For exchange. Looking through it was not a one-way act. Observation was the first gesture. Recognition was the handshake. And transmission was the consequence. I turned to face the center of the dome, feeling the curvature of the walls pull my thoughts inward. The mirrors began to hum again, gently, as if soothed by my understanding. Across the control panels, unreadable data flashed once and vanished. The observatory felt lighter, or perhaps my body had become more diffuse. I reached for the focus dial on the main interface, a gesture I had not made in many days, and without resistance, the dial turned. The lens shifted, and through it I no longer saw the sky. I saw layers of earth, of time, of thought. Each rotation brought forth a new depth, the shape of a chamber buried beneath the desert, the outline of a man standing in a collapsed corridor, the surface of a mirror reflecting stars not present in any catalogue, and then through one impossible alignment, saw the sun, but not the sun as I had known it, not the endless, punishing glare that loomed overhead, unchanged since the day I arrived. This was the other sun, the true sun, the one beneath it, behind it, beyond it, a massive, pulsing orb of structure and thought, shaped like an eye with no iris, ringed by glyphs that shifted as I watched. Its corona stretched like tendrils, folding in on themselves, forming shapes that echoed those of the daylight crew, of me, of the observatory itself. And in its center a mouth, not a literal mouth, a void, a negative space that sang, not in sound, in understanding. I heard nothing, but I knew. You have seen, now you reflect. I stepped back from the lens. My hand shook. My breath came shallow. Every atom in my body wanted to fall, to collapse, to yield to the pressure of comprehension. The observatory was not a station. It was not even a place. It was a concept, rooted into a sliver of desert where time had thinned. A place where the act of looking was the act of becoming. Every technician before me had stood here. Everyone had reached this point, and everyone had either turned away or looked too long. I understood then what happened to the daylight crew. They had not vanished. They had aligned. The inscription behind the lens was the final instruction. Not a directive, but a description. To look too long is not to die. It is to be used. I left the dome in silence. In the corridor, the mirrors no longer reflected anything at all, not even the light. They had become clear, and I knew when they began to reflect again, it would not be my face. It would be the sun's. There is a moment that occurs in solitude, true solitude, the kind not born of choice, but of inevitability, where the body begins to betray the shape it once held. You don't notice it immediately. The change comes slow, molecular, nested inside the breath, the gait. the muscle memory of days that no longer correspond to any rotation of the earth. You forget which hand you use to open doors. You forget the angle of your own voice. You forget your own weight. I had reached that moment long ago, but it wasn't until the shadow changed that I understood what I had become. Until then, I had thought I was holding together, that I was still tethered by some final strand of observation, that I remained, in essence, me. The last shard of identity, dulled but intact, flickering like static across a dead frequency. But the shadow does not lie. It was during what would have been the 26th waking, though the cycles had become approximate, nearly ceremonial, that I saw it first. Not the absence of light beneath me, but something else. I had moved to the engineering crawl space to check one of the backup generators. It had been running cold, not due to any failure in the system, but because the observatory no longer demanded power in any traditional sense. The facility had begun to power us, or what remained of us. The air was warm, humming low with a current that didn't pass through wire. I moved slowly across the grated floor, tools in hand, the echo of each footstep stretching longer than the last. And then, in the angle of a flickering bulb, I saw it my shadow, cast wrong. It wasn't the direction that troubled me first. The bulb above swung slightly with the residual hum of the base, its light drifting across the walls in a shallow arc. But my shadow didn't follow. It remained fixed, not to the geometry of the room, but to me. It trailed where it wished, stretching before my steps, not behind them, peeling away from the floor with the slow grace of heat rising from steel. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, not out of fear, but anticipation. Some buried part of me had known this was coming. I stepped again, carefully, deliberately, and the shadow delayed its response by nearly a full second before slithering into place, distorted not by light, but by thought. It curved upward against the wall, coiling slightly at the edges, like a creature waking from a long, dreamless sleep. I dropped the wrench. It didn't make a sound. The room held its breath, and the shadow blinked. Not literally, not with eyes, but with a tremor, a brief pause in its presence, a flicker as if something behind it had moved through it, brushing against its surface like wind on oil. I stared at it, unblinking, waiting for the fear to catch up. But it didn't. The fear had gone elsewhere, had taken residence in the vents, in the slits between mirror frames, in the space under the door that no longer locked. What I felt instead was recognition. I returned to the main corridor. Slowly, every light I passed cast the same anomaly, my shadow following on its own delay, moving just after I did, as though someone else walked with me, just one breath behind. In the reflection of the steel bulkhead outside the comp's room, I saw both shapes, my body and the thing that followed. It was not fully mine anymore. Its limbs bent slightly wrong, its angles too sharp, the proportions of its torso shifting as I inhaled. The longer I stared, the more it seemed to approach, even as I stood still. I covered the reflective surface with my coat and moved on. Back in the control chamber, I reviewed security footage, weeks of it, useless in most ways. But on the infrared layer, something glowed beneath me, not above, not in front, beneath, a signal of heat, faint but steady, building in cadence with the frequency of the hum. I checked logs from previous technicians. No mention, no record. The daylight crew had left behind no thermal anomalies. Whatever this was, it was new, or it had been waiting. Later, in the hydroponics bay long dead, long desiccated dye saw it again, this time not as a shadow, but a shimmer, a heat mirage along the edge of a mirror panel I had discarded weeks ago. The glass cracked in a spiral from the center, and behind it, my reflection stood perfectly still, though I was moving. Its chest rose and fell in a different rhythm. It watched me, not as a mirror, but as an aperture. It smiled, I turned and left. By the 27th cycle, the observatory had grown hot, not from systems, not from sun, but from within. The walls radiated warmth that had no source. Water condensed in corners where none had existed. The steel supports groaned in slow, regular intervals, as though the building were breathing. I sat in my quarters and turned off every remaining device. The silence pressed close. I felt the shadow behind me stretch against the wall, searching for corners I had not yet offered it. I lit a match not for light, not for heat, but to watch the flame flicker. The shadow did not react. It waited. I asked it a question. I said, "Are you here to replace me?" It did not answer, but the flame bent toward it. I began to sleep standing up. It wasn't a choice. My body no longer needed rest the way it had. I found myself drifting in corridors, waking in the dome, mouth dry, hands clutching objects I hadn't used in days. My skin felt thinner. My nails grew faster. My breath misted in cold rooms that should have been warm. I no longer left footprints. In the sublevel mirror chamber, the reflection finally spoke. Not in voice, in motion. It moved before I did. It raised a hand while I stood still. It tapped its temple. It stepped forward while I watched, unmoving. It reached for the glass. And as it did, the lights failed not all at once, but one by one, a chain of soft clicks echoing down the hall until I stood in perfect dark. The only illumination came from the mirror itself, which glowed faintly with its own internal light, casting the burning shape of the shadow behind me onto the opposite wall. The shadow raised its arm. So did the reflection, but I did not. They had become each other. I stepped backward, heart pounding, and the shape flickered out of existence. I returned to the mainframe. I ran a diagnostic scan of my own biological data: heartbeat, thermal profile, neurological rhythm. The system returned a warning I had never seen. Observer mismatch, reflection drift, 17.3%. It continued to climb. Each hour, the percentage increased. My body still functioned. My thoughts still formed. But I no longer recognized the shape they took when spoken aloud. I recorded a message to myself, played it back. The voice was mine, and not mine. It repeated the same phrase 3 times. "We see you now," then silence. I destroyed the console, but in its cracked screen, my shadow smiled. It was no longer burning. It was becoming, and I knew I was no longer casting it. It was casting me. The moments leading to the final transmission were neither sudden nor spectacular. They were a slow unraveling, the gradual dissolution of everything I had once trusted: time, memory, identity, until only one thread remained taut: the need to speak, to reach out, to record what remained of me before that faded. I had long stopped hoping for response, for rescue, for acknowledgement. The radio was a ghost channel, a cipher bouncing through static and silence. But still I spoke. The transmissions became rituals, codes whispered into the void. Fragments of thought captured in analog waves, desperate to anchor the intangible. I recorded my name, my dates of arrival, my observations of the sun's unnatural vigil. I told stories of the changing shadows, of the mirror's reflections, of the daylight crew and the calls from below. And yet, with every message sent, I felt the signal fold back on itself, the voice answering in cadence before I had even spoken. The observatory had become a loop, a mirror of sound and light trapped in perpetual reflection, and I was both prisoner and prisoner's echo. On what I can only designate as the final cycle, the 28th in my reckoning, I prepared the last broadcast. I sat in the control room, surrounded by the hum of the silent mirrors, the steady pulse of the unseen sun, the oppressive weight of countless days without dusk. My hands shook as I keyed the microphone, the analog switches clicking softly beneath my fingertips. I spoke slowly, deliberately, as though every word carried the weight of the world's memory. This is Technician 1431 2K of Sol 6 Observatory. If this message reaches any listener, human or otherwise, know that I am the last voice of those who stood before me. The sun has not set in 28 cycles. The mirrors no longer reflect. The shadow behind me breathes with its own life. The call from below is answered not with presence, but with becoming. I have walked the spiral stair, descended beneath the floor, and looked into the abyss that folds time. The observatory is not a place, but a passage, not a station, but a threshold, and I have crossed it. I paused, struggling to maintain coherence as the hum grew louder, pressing against my eardrums like a tide. The signal in the room shifted, oscillated between frequencies too high and too low for human hearing, filling the silence with a presence that was all at once infinite and suffocating. There are those who came before me, the daylight crew, those who aligned with the sun's gaze until their forms folded into the mirrors. They wait in the spaces between light and shadow. I see them now not as memories, but as companions. I am becoming one of them. I leave this message not as a warning, but as an invocation. For those who listen, know that the observatory never forgets its crew. It remembers, and it returns. I am both here and not here, present and absent, speaking and silent. If you hear this, do not answer, do not approach, do not seek the lens. For to look too long is to become the lens, to become the sun's shadow, to be folded into the endless cycle. The channel crackled, the static thickened into a dense fog of sound that swallowed the final words. Then silence. I remained in the control room, radio keyed but unresponsive, until the mirrors began to glow faintly, casting long shadows that twisted and bent, merging with the shapes I had come to know as the crew. My vision blurred, reality fracturing as if shattered glass reflected 1,000 impossible versions of myself. I reached out to steady myself, and my hand passed through the surface of a mirror, not glass, but a portal, an aperture into a space beyond comprehension. The last sensation I can recall is the warmth of the sun, not the harsh, unyielding orb that never set, but a gentle light that enfolded me, carried me beyond the horizon of time and self. The observatory's hum became a lullaby, the final note in a song that began long before me and would continue long after. The transmission ended. No one answered, but somewhere in the vast unknown, beyond the lens and the light, the message lives, waiting, listening, remembering, and I am part of it now, forever folded into the burning shadow of the sun that never sets. The day did not begin as days had before. There was no sun to greet, no horizon to mark the passage of time, only a vast emptiness where time itself seemed to gather like smoke, thickening and twisting into shapes that defied comprehension. I awoke not on the cot I had collapsed onto in exhaustion, but standing upright in the central chamber, my body feeling simultaneously my own and utterly foreign, as though I had stepped into a mirror and found a stranger reflected back. The observatory hummed with a resonance deeper than before, a frequency that vibrated within my bones, threading through the marrow like a secret whispered from the dark. The mirrors surrounding me no longer glinted or shimmered, but appeared as endless pools of liquid blackness, absorbing light and thought alike, reflecting nothing but the void within. As I moved through the corridors, the sensation of being observed grew overwhelming. It was not a simple awareness, but an intricate network of presence, as if countless eyes unseen traced my every step, following the pulse of my breath, measuring the cadence of my heartbeat. The shadows cast by the inert light seemed to twist and curl with intention, bending not away from me, but towards some unseen center, as if the darkness itself was alive, breathing and thinking. When I passed a mirror, I dared not look directly into it. The reflection did not mimic me, but distorted my image, elongating limbs, warping features, twisting expressions into a silent scream trapped beneath a mask of calm. The walls whispered, not with words, but with the weight of memories embedded in the very fabric of the observatory. Echoes of past technicians who had stood where I stood, who had looked through the same lenses and vanished into the same shadows. Their fears and hopes, their broken thoughts and final moments, all fused into a silent chorus that resonated in the hum of the machinery and the pulsing light of the sun that refused to set. I understood then that the observatory was not merely a place of science, but a repository of souls caught between existence and oblivion, a nexus where time folded and unfolded like the petals of a dark, infinite flower. In the heart of the dome, I found the final mirror larger than any before, its surface smooth and unblemished, yet impossibly deep. It did not reflect the sun, the observatory, or even myself. Instead, it held a vast expanse of blackness, punctuated by a single, glowing point of light that pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat. I stepped closer, drawn by an irresistible force, and as I reached out to touch its surface, the light expanded, engulfing me in a blinding radiance that transcended sight and sound, filling every cell with warmth and light beyond understanding. I became the lens. The observer and the observed merged into one. Time unraveled and rewound, spiraling through infinite cycles where past, present, and future were threads woven into a single tapestry. I saw the beginnings of the observatory, the faces of those who built it, and the endless procession of those who came after, each folded into the light, each becoming part of the eternal watch. The sun that never set was no longer a distant star, but a living eye, vast and unblinking, watching through the mirrors and lenses, through the corridors and chambers, through the very essence of the observatory. It watched and waited, patient beyond measure, drawing those who looked too long into its embrace. And I was among them. The day that watches back had come. I no longer stood alone, but was part of the silent vigil, an echo in the eternal light, forever folded into the burning shadow of a sun that does not set, a day without end, a memory without release.